Hi, everyone, and welcome to Open Door Philosophy, a podcast for a high school philosophy teacher, that's me, and his former student who's currently studying philosophy in college,
that's me,
unpack a variety of big philosophical questions in an understandable way, all towards the purpose of living a good life. Welcome to episode 12, where we're going to talk about the topic of how one should do philosophy. But before we get to that, Andrew, give us all that exciting summer news that you're involved in. What's going on in life?
Nothing much has changed. Just studying, keeping on studying. It's an arduous journey. I'm actually taking a logic course at our local community college starting tomorrow, so that will be fun. Hopefully, yeah. I'm going back downtown to Rice in a few days. I'm continuing with philosophy group there. We're studying, I guess, the topic of free will over the summer. So that's going to be a lot of fun.
Ooh, who are you? Like, what are some of those sources you're reading for free will?
I actually haven't looked over the list. He sent over a bunch of secondary sources. Let's see. I'll pull it up so I won't look. Timothy O'Connor, Daniel Winger, John Fisher, Harry Frankfurt, and then Eleanor Stump.
Wow, I'm not very familiar with any of those.
I haven't heard of any of them either. I think it'll be interesting because it's covering a whole kind of a bunch of different perspectives. There's some on like consciousness, so like philosophy of the mind / I guess like cognitive science, and then we're going all the way from that towards my favorite Aristotelian metaphysics. So that'll be a blast.
That's good stuff. Yeah, last year I kind of fell down the rabbit hole of consciousness, philosophy of consciousness, which is like really foundational for the idea of free will, libertarianism,
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so, well, heck, man, that sounds cool. What do you guys meet like once a week or?
Yeah, so during the normal school year, we meet like once a week and then for dinner. And then so the guy caters dinner for us. He's a professor. This is actually the same guy who I took my Plato class last semester for in my philosophy of religion course. So he's been a pretty big influence on my life. But yeah, so he caters food for us once a week, which is very nice. And we just talk. It's kind of nice too, because it's not just philosophy kids. So we get a bunch of, smart science kids and some of the Baylor med school kids come down and then some, it's a whole variety. So that's a lot of fun, brings a lot of depth to conversation. So yeah, that's been great. Yeah. What about you? I know you're about to have an exciting few weeks.
I've been looking forward to summer so much, and summer's very busy, but good busy, right? So this last week we went and helped our kids move. I think I mentioned that in the podcast last episode. So we got to do that, and I got to see our granddaughter, and that's very exciting. But now I never know quite how to present this because I feel a little embarrassed. Embarrassment of riches here. But we're getting ready to go to Poland to visit my brother-in-law. And while we're there, we're going to take a little side trip to Copenhagen, which I'm very excited about because the philosopher Kierkegaard is from there and really spent his entire life there. So I have a lot of Kierkegaard-related things to do. So we're excited about doing that. We're in the middle of packing. And I guess the thing that we don't really know a lot about, which will be interesting to live our way through, as I guess Kierkegaard would say, is what the COVID protocols are in those countries. We know that the countries are open, but don't know much more than that, really. Either way, we're looking forward to that, and that's what's on my horizon.
It's going to be a lot of fun. Next episode that we record, I'll be excited to hear about it.
Yeah. When I get back, if I've got a lot of good Kierkegaard dirt, we can do an episode on that. My intended purchase while I'm over there is to get a copy. I don't really care what the book is. Maybe either or Fear and Trembling, but some Kierkegaard book in Danish, which of course I won't be able to read, but I'll have it and it'll sit on my shelf and it will be cool.
That's a cool purchase for book lovers.
Okay, everybody, today our main topic is philosophical methodology, which is a lot of syllables. So let's just say it this way. How should someone do philosophy? Over the last 12 episodes, we've talked a lot about philosophy, but a lot of disciplines have a way that they go about doing. If you think about the historical methodology in terms of primary and secondary sources and evaluating those sources in order to try to paint a picture of an event that occurred. Of course, when you think of science, it's very easy to think of the scientific method, but there's also a lot of other methodologies that they have in it. Certainly, psychology has its methodologies. So when it comes to philosophy, which, as we discussed in episode 1, philosophy is kind of a difficult thing to pin down anyway.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, after like 25 or 3,000 years worth of philosophy, here we are in 2021, how do we do philosophy? So you as a person, as a listener, may be wondering the same thing for yourself. Maybe you're interested in some of the topics we've talked about. So you're like, well, how can I do philosophy? So that's what we wanted to talk about today, how to do philosophy. So Andrew, to get us going, what's your experience in college so far? You're a philosophy major and a classics major. So what's been your experience with philosophical methodology in terms of like the institution of college?
So I think the easiest answer to give, I think, which is kind of a cop out, is that really it's kind of more every professor has a slightly different way about going about things than others. So, for instance, one course that I took, it was kind of like a modern philosophy course. It was more emphasized, like the way that you did philosophy was more of kind of just straight lecture based, which I think is important. And I'll go over that in a minute. But basically, it was just straight lecture. So the students, like how you would learn philosophy, how you would do philosophy is you would listen to a specialist and learn about it that way. We would have readings, of course, and then those readings would be lectured about. So I guess in that way, there's kind of the reading portion where you're learning that way, and then you're kind of ironing out the ways of doing things in kind of a lecture format. And then I think that my favorite, at least, probably the most that I've seen is something like you do the readings in class, you do the lecture where you kind of talk about it, you learn about the philosophy, you raise questions, not questions like to the extent of like, oh yeah, like I disagree with this person, but more along the lines of what does this person mean when Plato says X, or when Descartes says Y. So that's that kind of portion of the class, and then you kind of spend some time thinking more about it. You meet with the professor or another student one-on-one to talk about maybe problems that you had thinking about the philosophy. Not like problems, like I guess that's more for the lecture, but like issues you see in the philosophy. So you're learning how to criticize it there. And then I think the most important part is writing about philosophy. That's where you really get to experiment. And I think that's where you learn the most, at least for me. I've learned the most about philosophy from writing. And I think writing has its own methodology of its own. I think that's something we'll probably talk about later. But yeah, that's just a brief kind of look at what I've seen. But I'm kind of interested to hear what it's like for you, kind of on the opposite end. I mean, I know you've studied philosophy for a long time, so I'm interested to hear what you think about on that end, but also how you've kind of taught it as a teacher.
Yeah, so with all the involvement I've had with philosophy and reading philosophy, I think the one thing I've come to in terms of a conclusion on methodology is that there is no one way to write philosophy. We've certainly on this program talked about all different types of methods of writing. So, we've done everything from dialogues to aphorisms to poetry to nonfiction, very technical writing. All of these count, as philosophy, essays, of course. But you also have a certain amount of consistent sort of types of activities within those writings. Some a little more pronounced than others. For instance, clarifying terms it generally seems to be an important part of philosophy. Creating sometimes, and we'll get into all of these later, sometimes thought experiments to try out theories without actually trying them out. We can also like push the boundaries of theories through thought experiments. Certainly things like comparing theories, offering arguments and counter arguments, and subjecting your arguments to scrutiny, perhaps also trying to create logic using deductive or inductive reasoning to try to arrive at a conclusion. So there's a lot of things that philosophy seems to do consistently, like the ones I just mentioned. However, how it's written seems to be kind of all over the place. Although I would say, I think as a whole, at least in the Western tradition, most philosophy is kind of written in a straightforward, dialectical or logical sort of way. We do have these people like Nietzsche or Plato who writes in very different styles. But I guess as far as I got off track there, as far as teaching philosophy, how to do philosophy in my course, these students, when they take my course, is generally their first exposure to philosophy in any sort of way. So one of the things I really try to get my students to do is ask good questions. Asking questions is certainly a part of philosophy. The better the question is, the better the philosophical reflection is going to be. So asking good questions is a part of that. When we come to writing essays in class about philosophy, I think a lot of it's what I've already said. The student needs to make a claim, then they need to justify that claim, and then they need to try to poke holes in that claim and see how strong it is, if you will, how strong its bones are. And then, of course, we reference other philosophers who have written on that particular topic, see what their theories are, see how well they hold up, and contrast those theories to ours. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of how I do it in my class.
What I was talking about before might be confusing a lot of listeners, because I think that I kind of maybe seemed like I was missing the point of like what a methodology was. I was seemingly more talking about learning than like doing, I suppose, when I was talking. So I think that it's important when I'm thinking about like doing philosophy. A big part, at least at my stage of my philosophy journey, is about learning philosophy. I think that's like the most crucial part of doing philosophy is learning about philosophy. Not only like learning about the tools that philosophers have used, like Mr. Parsons said, like there's learning logic, learning thought experiments, learning how to make a claim, how to do this, how to make counter arguments. That's like those are the tools that you need, and you need a very firm foundation in those tools. And I think you also need a great foundation in past philosophers too, like learning what they think. I think this is important for two reasons. First, you get to see how those tools are used best. So you get to see 2,000-year evolution of those tools. Like when you read Aristotle, you get really good use of logic, inductive reasoning, and such. And you get to see how that's developed. So you get to really refine your own tools by noticing how these philosophers are making their claims. But also, you're learning, like, when you're thinking about philosophy too, it's not just about those tools, it's about the arguments themselves. So, like, I guess those tools are how you make those arguments, how you evaluate them, but you also need to learn the arguments themselves and how they've been brought forth throughout time, right? So, like, if I'm thinking about justice, which is, I think, a popular concept, or ethics or something like that, like, I have to go back and learn about, Plato. I need to go back and learn the evolution of ethical thinking throughout time for two reasons again. First, so you're not like mistaking. So you're not covering a topic that's already been covered extensively. Also, too, though, like you need this foundation to make good arguments in the future, right? Like, so your work's not only like justifiable, but also so it's growing and you're making an accurate contribution too. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's important.
No, absolutely. And if I minimized any of that, I certainly didn't mean
No,
to.
no.
You're absolutely right. When I think of like in very general, broad terms, how to do philosophy, well, the word that comes to mind is engagement. You've got to engage with philosophy. Well, how do we engage with philosophy? Well, it's by learning and it's by writing. That's or well, I'll say learning and communicating, right? So whether it's introspective writing with ourselves, or whether it's having a dialogue with another person, having a conversation with another person, when it comes to learning philosophy, whether that's through formal learning, like you would receive at a school or a university, or whether that's a self-taught method, either way, you have to engage with these ideas. I can't remember who said it, but I read it somewhere at one point, that philosophy is really kind of like you said, really just a 2000 or whatever year we want to throw at that, a 2000-year-old conversation. In a way, when you read the old philosophers on whatever topic you're interested in, a couple weeks ago we did an episode on the immortality of the soul, right? So there is a thousands-year-old conversation about that topic, and so by engaging with these past philosophers, you're increasing your understanding of what has already been covered. You can see how those arguments have evolved over time and see where the current arguments are. Believe it or not, immortality of a soul is still a very current topic in philosophy. It's alive and well. Richard Swinburne, an Oxford philosopher of religion, just wrote a book a year or two ago called "Are We Bodies or Are We Souls?" So it's a very long. Each one of these topics are a very long conversation, and yeah, it's good to engage with these things. And I'll say, a benefit that you and I have, or anyone else listening has right now, is the accessibility of all these materials.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to learn about the immortality of the soul, you go to Google, and you can find a list of sources pretty quickly. And then you can hop on Amazon and you can search out those sources. And within 36 to 48 hours, you can have a stack of books if you really want to. The amount of resources we have today is tremendous versus, say, 50 years ago, if I wanted to learn about the immortality of the soul. Oh, good grief. I'm at a library, which I love libraries, of course. I'm at a library looking through, note card systems, trying to find these sources. And, oh, man, it's just so much easier today to engage, I think.
There's definitely two areas when you're thinking, just to summarize, I guess what we've been saying is there's kind of two, at least seemingly two kind of areas. You need both the tools, such as the argumentation, learning how to write and communicate well, learning all of these things, and also the background knowledge. So I have a question for you on that topic. When I first got into philosophy, the first place that I looked, it was that kind of, I wanted to improve my knowledge base. So learning about what these philosophers thought, but probably until I took your class, honestly, which wasn't that long after, probably a year or two after, it was at that time where I started learning the skills, does that make sense? The tools behind it.
Uh-huh.
So for someone who maybe has never taken a philosophy class, who's just listening to this podcast and this is their introduction to philosophy, but they're interested maybe learning more about the tools, how would you recommend that someone might do that?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to engage with your own questions and ideas in a critical way, probably through writing. It would be the easiest way. Say you have a question on whether or not God exists. Well, that's a huge question. So what I would recommend in being philosophical about that question is to sit down and start writing other questions that are related to that question. And then begin writing what you think about it. The thing that I love about writing is it formalizes in a almost tangible way. It brings into reality thought. Thought is just something that happens inside our minds. And once we write it down, then we can look at it and we can go back to it and we can reference it. And it sort of makes it, if you will, a little more real. And so this is why I think writing is such an important part of doing philosophy. So again, back to this example of your question about whether or not God exists. So you will have opinions about that. So start writing those opinions down. and then scrutinize those opinions. And when we scrutinize, of course, we're not meaning to be negative or mean or harsh or trying to destroy a theory or something like that. We're interested in the questions and the answers that are behind it, right? When we're being critical about questions and claims. And so write down these thoughts that you have, your claims, if you will, and then see how justifiable they are. And as you go through this process, you'll begin to clarify what you think about a topic. And through that clarification process, you'll likely have more questions that come about. And then I think you begin to naturally go out into the world of knowledge that exists and begin seeking what other thinkers have said about those very same questions. That's one of the great things about the human enterprise, if you will, is that even though we're all individually different, certainly there is some commonality in the concerns we have, and we're still answering some of the same questions that were asked in philosophy thousands of years ago, and that's that common human experience. So the questions you have, whatever questions it is philosophically you're interested in, I guarantee you someone's written about it, someone's dealt with it. So go out and see what they think.
Yeah, I think that's honestly the best place to go. And I think just if you're having trouble coming up with arguments, or maybe like say you have this topic, you write what you think, you're having a hard time criticizing it. I promise you can find something, which is a good experiment on its own. Like if you think your argument is good, try to find like ways you can poke holes in it, because I promise they're there. And that's kind of how you get better, I think, at the argumentation, even in seeing like flaws in arguments. I know I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but in Plato's Republic, really in all his works, like Plato naturally leaves holes open in arguments for readers to try to find, which is really cool. And so I think that's an important part of philosophy itself, being able to determine if an argument's valid, invalid, not in the logical sense, of course, but like just, does this follow? Like, does this make sense? So one way of doing that is learning how to do that is critiquing your own arguments. Another way is like that I found helpful is looking on like TV or like the radio, listening to people's, or in everyday life, honestly, like listening to people's ideas and then being skeptical about them. Like you don't have to go up to their face and tell them, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. But like, I think asking why someone holds that opinion, following that down the rabbit hole and seeing if it has any roots to it. Can you explain this position? If someone says like, or is God real? If someone says, if you pose the question, is God real? And then, an argument against that is that, well, that's stupid or something like that. That's not a good argument. So I think like there needs to be a why behind it. So always be asking and thinking of why.
Yeah, on that point, when you said why, it just immediately clicked in my head. It's kind of basic, but when you're being critical of your own claims, if you just ask why, every time you write a claim, you make a claim. If you ask why, the old why game, that little kids drive their parents nuts with, it really pushes you to try to answer those in some sort. Well, it helps clarify your answer.
The why game is the best.
Right. Yeah. So if you're like, I believe God exists, well, why? So then you have to come up with reasons. And for each one of those reasons, you're like, okay, well, why? And it just kind of keeps going.
There's this question I've been thinking about when we've been planning for this episode. So I'm interested to hear what you think. What do you think about, do you think like verbal debates constitute some type of philosophy?
So this is interesting. One of the things I identified as a tool of philosophy is having a dialogue with someone. And you can get on YouTube, you can get on other podcasts, and you can listen to philosophers debate their particular points. I feel like it's beneficial in a way that when we listen to two people having well, you know what? I'm going to talk about clarifying terms here for a second. Conversation versus debate. Okay, so if we have two philosophers having a conversation about something, well, that's a back and forth exchange where you have some openness to the ideas that are being discussed, and you're interested in what the other person has to say, versus a debate, which is a format that is designed where you have two people who are attempting to prove that their point is the correct point. And in a way, I feel that's kind of contrary to what philosophy is. Of course, philosophy, we want to arrive at some sense of what truth is. But in a debate where a person is from the get go attempting to prove that their position is right, they're not necessarily open to what the other person has to say. They're only going to want to attack what the other person has to say, and certainly defend their position versus a conversation. But either way, I think from both of those formats, we can gain philosophical knowledge from those, especially if they are very learned people. Now, if you're talking about two friends getting together, this is a type of philosophy as well, right? If it's just you and your buddies and you're hanging out, doing whatever, and some really interesting topic that is very open-ended comes up, and it has to do with, existence and some deep human questions, maybe like, I don't know, like what is the purpose of life? Something like that. I mean, that's kind of like Plato's Symposium, really. Just add some wine, and and you just got friends talking about this very deep topic, and through that, again, you can arrive at philosophical truths. The thing, I guess, that I'll say, I don't know if I want to say like against dialogue of this type, is that it happens in real time. And that's fine, except that once what is said, it disappears, versus writing, whereas you can go back and reference arguments and points that people have made. So maybe that if there is a downside to it, maybe that's it. I don't know. What do you think? I may have gone a completely different direction you intended. What do you think?
Well, I think your conversation point is correct, like differentiating between the two. Yeah, I think conversations are helpful in learning more for both sides, but there's nothing more that I despise than philosophy debates. I don't know. I guess I used to be more interested in them, but I guess maybe it's just the people that maybe I have them with or something. I don't know. I just don't think they're very fertile. For instance, like if my job is to explain things well, and that's the only job I have as a philosopher, not saying I am one, but just like if I was, then I think the rhetoric of a debate pushes you into bad positions or having to make bad arguments or things of that nature. I think rhetoric plays a huge part in debates. For example, like,
What do you mean by rhetoric?
yeah, so I think using tactics of speech to trap opponents into making concessions that, some people criticize Plato or Socrates for this. I don't think it's true, but like I always think of the sophists. They're a good example of this, and I think it happens in modern day too. So I'll just give a bit of background real quick on the sophists before I talk about the modern day. But the sophists were these people who basically taught really anything, but we think of them as like rhetoricians, like teaching people how to thought. Their whole goal was teaching people how to make the weaker argument the stronger. So there's this really famous Helen, I forget who the sophist is, Gorgias maybe, who basically convinces his interlocutor that Helen was not wrong for X, Y, and Z reasons for leaving, like for going to Troy. Like, I don't know, it's quite famous, but the arguments that he uses aren't necessarily like, they're not good arguments. They're just good in the moment. So I think
There are arguments made that are specifically meant to pin the opponent in a corner and
right,
win the argument.
Right. So like, there's a difference between winning an argument and making groundbreaking or making good arguments, if that makes sense, right? I think that you can trap someone in a corner in an argument, but that argument that they trapped you in doesn't necessarily have to make sense. And I think often it doesn't, because in the moment when you're in a debate, you're like, you're fighting for your life, it seems. I have these moments sometimes. Other people probably do, but you're thinking about it like hours later and you're like, oh, like I could have brought this point up or this point. So I think maybe it is effective But I think, like you said, like people, fall victim to this too, but like people just hold their beliefs so strongly that it's just not even worth your time, sometimes too. So I don't know. It's just like almost every philosophy debate that I've been in has never yielded good conversation. I don't know.
Right, and oftentimes those rhetorical devices make an appeal to emotion. It's an attempt to make the other person feel like they're a bit against the ropes, but it's also for the audience who's listening.
Yeah.
It's meant to sort of incite and rise emotion within them, and yeah, that might help win an argument, but that certainly doesn't like further some conversation or concept within philosophy. It doesn't bear good fruit, I guess you could say.
So that's just something I've been thinking about this a lot because I think I was introduced to philosophy through doing debate, and I don't know. I've just been kind of disappointed through in that for the past when I've been thinking about it. So that's why I wanted to bring it up.
No, I think it's good. I read this book earlier in the year called Philosophical Methodology. Is one of Oxford's very short introduction books,
Hmm.
and it talks about, maybe it's chapter 3, like it calls it adversarial dialogue, and it is a thing. Like at universities, or when a philosopher is at a conference and they present their theories, afterwards there's a question and answer session, and the philosopher stands up there and has to answer these questions right there in the moment. And oftentimes people at these conferences approach the question and answer session as a means to, of course, be critical of what the philosopher has presented, but oftentimes it turns into a sort of back and forth between the person asking the question and the philosopher, and it can get kind of nasty. And again, I don't understand that. I don't understand why that's a thing today in philosophy, especially at conferences. Whereas I would like to think of the philosophical community as one that is very opening and embracing of ideas and dealing with ideas. That's the only way we arrive to greater truths. But there is kind of this apparently this darker underside of adversarial dialogue, and I don't find anything beneficial in those.
Want to move past this topic, but I always think of like there's the famous Noam Chomsky Foucault debate on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen it, but I watched it one time. I'm sure people have seen it, but I don't know. They just talk past each other, and that's just what seems to happen in all of these debates.
Yeah, some other names you could throw in that category. Richard Dawkins
Hmm.
is very adversarial. Jordan Peterson drives me nuts. I think if you want to look up some philosophers that I think are very engaging and very open minded, Keith Frankish is one. Philip Goff is another. Those two disagree with each other on many matters of consciousness, yet they have a podcast together.
Hmm.
And I think they're a good example of what philosophy can be, as opposed to this adversarial style. Hey guys, Mr. Parsons here. Hope you're enjoying the show so far. Just wanted to take this brief opportunity to say, if you like what we're doing, subscribe to the channel and pass it along to your friends so that they might be able to enjoy it as well. And also, please join us for our next episode, which will be on the Danish existentialist philosopher Søren Kierkegaard. We'll talk about his life, his unfortunate romance, and some of his ideas and theories, especially the theory of subjective truth. So we hope we'll see you there, and now back to the show.
I think this next topic goes hand in hand with that. If it seems kind of hard to do philosophy with someone else, in a lot of situations, maybe there's some where it's easy, but is philosophy then something we could really do alone?
Oh yeah, the old trope of like the philosopher who locks himself in a cabin for 2 years and doesn't communicate with anyone. Can philosophy be done in isolation?
Yeah.
Well, it's a great question. I don't know. I feel like I'm answering a lot of questions. You wanna take a stab at that before I do?
I think yes. I mean, I think like maybe it's just like the philosophical tradition that I think I'm leaning towards, but I just think, your reason is so powerful. And yeah, maybe other people can be critical of your work, which leads to better argument, but it would seem like your reason alone can deal quite a bit of insight. So I think you can. I mean, I'm thinking of like, some of maybe your favorite people seems to be kind of similar. I don't know if they actually were, but that's at least like the kind of rumors. And then I know Cicero was like, I mean, I guess he was writing letters, but Cicero was he was exiled by himself for about 2 years too, writing a bunch of treatises. So yeah, I think that I think you can. But what do you think about it?
Well, I think you can. I also think, however, bringing your theories out into the light of day and letting other people engage with them is beneficial. It can help you refine. It's very easy to get too deep into our own heads and our own theories without being able to test them out. I mean, we can test ourselves, sure. I mean, I talked about that earlier with writing, but I also think whether the person is right or wrong or ridiculous or really on point or whatever, when we present our theories to other people, it becomes live and I think it becomes a stronger piece of philosophy because sometimes we are very blind to our own biases and we might think that we've really come up and constructed with a fantastic theory. And then we finally let it out into the world and someone brings up a very good point that we might be able to refine and make into a stronger theory. So, all that being said, I greatly value the introspective nature of philosophy. I constantly journal about all kinds of philosophical issues, and I find that to be very beneficial. And I revisit those, and then sometimes they turn into essays or something like that. But once I write that essay, and maybe it gets published somewhere, then now the community, the community of inquirers can engage with it.
Kind of like I was mentioning earlier with this kind of 2,000-year-old history of philosophy, I guess, that's been built up. I guess that progress depends on people putting out work. So imagine, like, I forget who said this too, but someone's like, all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato or something.
Oh yeah, I think that's Alfred North Whitehead maybe said that.
Yeah, but like, imagine if Plato didn't publish any of his works. That seems just like it would have been a total disaster. Maybe not for Plato, but just for the growth of humanity too,
Absolutely.
and philosophy, right? Like, if philosophy is this, we're comparing. The reason we got on this topic is because you raised the question that these other disciplines have, like science, they have their own methodologies, like the scientific method for going about their experiments. But there's that Isaac Newton said, "I've seen further by standing on the shoulders of giants." And so, like, it's testing out these hypotheses that have built upon by other people, and that's pretty much exactly what you do in philosophy too. So yeah, I mean, like, I think that you can philosophize, you can be a philosopher by yourself in terms of like writing, putting out work, and thinking of new critical ideas that are influential, but coming up with, leaving an impact, being a very good philosopher, I think, and making a lot of progress in philosophy is dependent on publishing work too. At least putting it out there, maybe not publishing, but putting it out there.
So, when you talk about this 2,000-year-old conversation of philosophy and standing on the shoulders of giants, I really don't believe in eureka moments. Archimedes is the one who, so I guess, for lack of a better term, coined this phrase, eureka, and he discovered, it dawned on him the answer to this complex question that he was dealing with. I think those moments happen on occasion, but they're very few and far between. And this is why, really going back to what you mentioned much earlier in the episode, which is the importance of becoming familiar with philosophers and their theories. Like, it is we really shouldn't rely on eureka moments happening. The philosophy and improving theories is just the hard work of learning from others and moving forward, building on top of that.
Right. Kant, for example, I would say he's one of the most groundbreaking philosophers ever. Just like in his critique of pure reason, I don't know, he puts down some interesting counter arguments to a popular idea about reason going on with this time. But I always think about, like, Hume came before him, and Kant was inspired largely by Hume, I believe. Well, not only by Hume, but like his critique of pure reason, like his most notable, groundbreaking, influential text is because Hume published his On Reason. That Kant didn't have a eureka moment by himself, but it was based upon his careful study of this Humean publication that I'm sure he'd studied for a long time. So it's like progress, I guess, is also dependent upon, like you're saying, like dependent upon reading, learning, publicizing, etc.
Yeah, I mean, a eureka moment can happen, but in reality, that eureka moment is the product of a great deal of study
Yeah. Yeah.
in the field. I mean, you can't have that moment of clarity without having a firm foundation. I think. Well, let's move on to another tool that's often used in philosophy, and that's what's called thought experiments. Now, this might be a funny phrase to people who are unfamiliar with it, but if you think about the methodology, certainly in the sciences, where they conduct experiments to prove their claims, or in psychology, obviously they conduct experiments. So in philosophy, oftentimes with the abstract nature of some of the things that philosophy engages with, it's very difficult to conduct experiments. And so philosophers over the years have come up with basically creating hypothetical situations to try to test out their theories. And they call these thought experiments. So, Andrew, can you think of any thought experiments that are sort of well known, at least to you?
The one that I always think of, and the one that I've used the word despise once already, and I'll use it again. Despise the most is the trolley car problem. I I don't know why people love that so much. Basically,
Yeah. So explain like what it is and when what it is experimenting on.
so it's this problem where, so say, I guess you're on some kind of pedestal, looking down below, and you see that there's 5 people tied down to a train rail or a trolley rail, and there's a train coming fast. It's approaching. And so you're on this pedestal, and you have the ability to pull back the lever and make the trolley or train go onto the other track. So you'll be sparing these 5 people. But in that same, kind of way, when you pull it back, there's going to be one person, like, I guess there's just one person on this other rail. So you would be killing one person if you pulled the lever and averted it from killing those 5. So I guess it's a popular way to think about 2 types of ethical systems: deontology and utilitarianism. I think I've probably heard it more with utilitarianism, but I think you can use it with deontology. But like a utilitarian, for instance, someone who values doing an action which would benefit the greatest good or the greatest amount, they would say that you should obviously pull back the lever and save the 5 people in sacrifice of the one. So it's just a way of thinking about these. I don't know. I have some problems with this, but yeah, Mr. Parsons, what do you think about? Are there any famous ones that maybe you enjoy more than I do?
Well, the trolley problem does drive me crazy. I'm so tired of that thought experiment, but it's a very well known one. And I guess the thing that's fun about thought experiments is you can begin asking questions like, well, okay, who are these 5 people tied to the track? And who is that one person tied to the track? And does the trolley represent anything? And in fact, do I, as the observer, represent anything? And what is the lever? And and it can just go on and on and on. One of the thought experiments we've mentioned in a previous episode, the episode on Descartes, He imagines this scenario where there is a demon who is attacking his mind, his brain, and possibly creating a false reality for him. And he uses that in a way to try to prove as to whether or not he exists, where he gets down to his famous cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. But probably one of the better known, more modern ones would be from the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, who's a utilitarianist and an effective altruist. So he has this thought experiment about a child drowning in a pond. So Singer's idea is that, like, what we should do if we have the resources available to us is help as many people as possible. That's a very utilitarian approach. So in his thought experiment, it goes something like this. Okay, so you're walking to work one day, and it's in the morning time, you're on your way to work, and you're walking through your favorite park, and there's a pond in the park, and you hear some splashing in the water of the pond, and you sort of realize that it's not like normal, like ducks splashing around or something like that. It has a different sound to it. And so you go over to investigate, and you see in this pond a small child who is drowning. They're trying to save themselves from drowning. And you look around, and there's no one around. There's no parents. There's no authorities. It's just you and the kid. So the question is, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to keep going to work, because you don't want to be late? You don't want to jeopardize your job or anything like that? Or are you going to save the child? And of course, Singer's response is that almost every human being would save the child. No one's going to care about their nice suit that they're wearing or dress that they're wearing. They're not going to worry about whether or not they're an hour late to work or whatever. They're going to save the child because, like, that's what humans do, right? And so his point is, if you, as a human being, would be willing to save the child that is suffering in front of you, like this child immediately in front of you in the pond, why would you not, if you have the resources to do so, why would you not save a child who is suffering, a child that you will never see in another country, in another place, that you would be able to benefit them and alleviate their suffering by perhaps providing housing or food or healthcare or something like that. So that's a pretty famous thought experiment from an ethical standpoint of this issue of, like, helping the person who's in front of you versus helping someone that you will likely never meet. But I also think thought experiments are a little dangerous too. Sometimes they can mislead the reader. Sometimes they can be used as a rhetorical question without being a rhetorical question. Attempting to prove a point without really proving it. They come up with a thought experiment, and you're like, "Aha! See, this proves it." And sometimes there's a lot of assumptions made on the reader's part, and the writer can use that assumption as a way to prove a point, whether that's done in a justified way or an unjustified way. But it is relied upon quite frequently by philosophers. So whether or not we think they're good or bad, they are frequently used in something that people should be familiar with if they are involved in doing philosophy.
Yeah, like just going back to the beginning, when we were talking about the tools, like the education on the tools as something important in the methodology of philosophy, like learning your flaws, learning your fallacies is super important because I don't know, I think just like learning about logic is so crucial in philosophy because you learn how arguments fail. Or how they can fail. So you can avoid them on your own, and you can, I guess knowledge can't be false. So I was going to say you would learn false knowledge, but that's kind of that's not real. So you can avoid adopting false beliefs if you spend a good time learning about fallacies.
This has been a good conversation about how to do philosophy. Certainly, we encourage people who are interested in what we talk about on the show and in philosophy, and really just engaging with really big, important questions that are related to living. That's really kind of what philosophy is, that you certainly just begin by being critical of your beliefs, And you probably do that through some of the methodologies that we talked about, such as journaling. So anyway, guys, if you have any questions for us, we'd be very happy to answer them if you'd email us at opendoorphilosophy@gmail.com about how to do philosophy. We'd be happy to engage with you on that. But I think we've milked the cow dry. What a terrible
analogy.
how's that for an analogy? Yes, okay. Well, anyway, it's time to move on to the quote corner.
I thought it was a good analogy, actually, but
that's good too. It's just really funny. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Quote Corner, a portion of our show where we take a philosophy quote and rate it on a scale of 1 to 5 stars. Today was my choice, so I decided to go with something non-Western. So I have a quote today from the great Indian epic, the Bhagavad Gita. And the quote says this: "Just as a reservoir is of little use when the whole countryside is flooded, scriptures are of little use to the illuminated man or woman who sees the Lord everywhere." So here in the last couple of weeks in Houston, we might feel like the reservoir has broken and the countryside is flooded. But there's the quote. Andrew, what do you think of it?
I was trying to be more critical of this quote when I first read it. I don't know. It almost feels wrong for me to agree with. But then, as a good methodological philosopher would do, I asked myself why did I feel this way? So I couldn't really come to a good reason why not to like it. I was thinking about Plato and Aristotle, who I've spent too much time with over the past year. And I was thinking of Thomas Aquinas too. I was thinking like people in my own life what would they say about these things? And I was thinking, maybe it's not so far from being wrong. I don't want to push this back to Western philosophy because it's different, and it's also kind of a religious text too. So I don't want to apply this, but it seems like if you reach this ultimate state, it would seem like you've learned everything you can from scripture, so you don't need to study them anymore. But this is also with the understanding like this enlightenment or this like just this illumination is like an extremely difficult place to reach, and something that's like almost impossible, probably has been impossible to reach. So is it probably true? Yes. Is it something that's attainable? I don't think so. What do you think about it, Mr. Parsons?
Well, at first glance, I like the analogy. I think it's a good analogy. And this is actually a really great example of this isn't exactly a thought experiment, but the importance of using analogy. Sure. I mean, when Hurricane Harvey hits Houston, we don't need all of our water towers. There's plenty of water everywhere. I'm not really sure where I was going with that. But I think the thing that jumps out to me about this particular quote is the term illuminated. And in every religious tradition, in every wisdom tradition, we see mention made of someone that we might call the sage or the wise one, or, it's these people who have, for whatever reason, have managed to reach a stage of understanding of existence that some of the things that perhaps ground us, like scripture, is not necessary for them anymore because they're so immersed into whatever wisdom tradition that is. I think actually, you mentioned Thomas Aquinas. Near the end of his life, he had a religious experience. And one of his famous quotes there after it is that, "After what I have experienced, everything that I have learned and believed and known is like straw." And of course, straw is in that context, straw is a material that is useless to the baker. It's the wheat head that's important, that makes flour. Straw just gets cast aside. It's not nutritious. But like, how many of us, really attain this level?
Yeah.
I Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
No, that's exactly what I think too. Like I don't know if this is a possible state to reach, and I don't know if it's meant to be. At least in like a physical, at least while we're here, I don't know if that's like a place that anyone could reach. But and I don't know. Like I was thinking of the reason I mentioned Aquinas is because he's this big Aristotelian, and I think Aristotle would say like, once you've reached this illuminated state, eudaimonia, it's not going to be a thing you're going to have to practice or read, right? It's just going to be this lifestyle that you've adopted and you've been habituated in. So I was thinking, like if you've learned everything there is to learn from those scriptures and you're following it to the key, you're habituated into that, it would seem like it's pointless, and you've gotten every single drop out of it that's possible. And it would seem like it's useless, but it doesn't really seem like that's possible, I don't know. Maybe it is possible, but it seems extremely hard. Like it's almost a goal to work. Maybe like the quote isn't that like it's a possible state to reach, but it's a goal. Almost like, the goal of reaching eudaimonia is a goal. Like it's the goal to get so much out of scripture that you don't need to reference back towards it.
I mean, I guess to flip it and maybe talk about possible counter argument. Like you said, I think this quote deals with used habituation. I think of embodiment, like living, not studying the scriptures, but living the scriptures. And when you live the scriptures, it's habituated into, you embody those, you just become the scriptures. The similar notion is talked about in the Tao Te Ching, where the Taoist sage doesn't have to tell people that he's a Taoist sage. People know that he's a Taoist sage by what he does, by his embodiment of it. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is a bit what this is trying to say. If you are so illuminated by everything that you've experienced in your study of scripture, then perhaps it does change your view of things, and you do see God everywhere. I don't know. It's very interesting quote, I think.
Yeah, I would be interested in hearing what someone who's like well-versed in Hindu scripture might say about this. If I think I agree with you for the most part, for every part, really.
Well, that's so encouraging. All right. Let's see if you agree with my star rating. So I'm going to give this quote. I'm going to give it a 4.
Oh, the number that popped out of my head was 3.5, so I'm going to go with that.
Oh, I almost said that.
Yeah, so I'll go with 3.5. All right, everybody, that's going to wrap it up for today's episode. We really appreciate you for spending your valuable time with us, listening to us today.
We'd love it if you'd leave a positive review and subscribe to our podcast so that you'll know when new episodes drop, and that way you can pass it on to your friends who are probably wondering how to do philosophy as well.
We'd really love to hear from you. If you'd like to tell us what you think of the show, have a question you would like us to discuss, or a philosophy quote you'd like us to rate, please email us at opendoorphilosophy@gmail.com.
You can follow All the Philosophy on Twitter, Instagram, and our website at opendoorphilosophy.com, where you can find many things about the show.
Thank you, everyone, so much for listening, for learning with us. We'll see you next time, and remember, when your life seems in need of some philosophy, the door is always open.